I stood in my garden, watching a stranger hammer wooden stakes into my blooming lavender beds. That was the exact moment I realized my daughter, Tiffany, had sold my retirement sanctuary behind my back. She traded 35 years of my hard work as a librarian for a closet full of designer handbags and a penthouse in the city. But Tiffany made one grave mistake. She was so blinded by her new luxury life that she never actually read the land deed. My father was a very wise man. He left me a secret trust that would eventually turn her million-dollar dream into a legal nightmare. Today, Tiffany is no longer wearing Prada. She is shivering in a tattered tent in the woods, with nothing but the sky for a roof. She sold my peace, so I took back her future. Now, she finally understands the difference between a wardrobe and a home. Before I reveal the clever trap my father set decades ago, I would love to know something. Which beautiful part of America are you watching from today? Please share your city and state in the comments below. I spent 35 years of my life surrounded by the quiet hum of the library. To some, being a librarian might seem like a boring job. But for me, it was a calling. I loved the smell of old paper, the hushed whispers of students, and the feeling of helping someone find exactly what they were looking for. I worked for a public university in New York, and I was proud of it. I was never a woman who needed much. I did not care for flashy cars or expensive jewelry. My goal was simple. I wanted a place where I could grow old in peace. For 35 years, I saved every single penny I could. I skipped the fancy vacations. I repaired my old clothes instead of buying new ones. I lived a very modest life. All for one dream. That dream was a small wooden cottage in upstate New York. It sat right on the edge of a crystal-clear lake. The air there always smelled like pine needles and fresh water. When I finally made the final payment and held the keys in my hand, I cried. It was not just a house. It was my sanctuary. It was my reward for a lifetime of hard work and service. In that cottage, I felt safe. I had a porch where I could sit in my rocking chair and watch the sunset hit the water. I had shelves filled with all the books I never had time to read while I was working. It was my own little piece of heaven on earth. I truly believed I would spend the rest of my days right there, listening to the birds and enjoying the silence. At 65 years old, my body was tired, and my eyesight was starting to fade. Reading the fine print on tax documents and utility bills became a struggle. That was when my daughter, Tiffany, stepped in. She was my only child, and I loved her with all my heart. She seemed so concerned about me. She told me that she wanted to help. She said, "Mom, let me handle the boring paperwork." She suggested that I add her name as a co-owner of the cottage. She told me it was just a safety measure, so she could pay the property taxes and manage the repairs if I ever got too sick to do it myself. I trusted her. Why wouldn't I? She was my daughter. I thought I was lucky to have such a caring child. I didn't realize that I wasn't signing a document for my protection. I was signing away my peace. I was handing a wolf the keys to my sanctuary. I had worked 35 years for that home, and in one afternoon I gave her the power to take it all away. I remember the last evening I sat on that porch before everything changed. The water was so still. The loons were calling out across the lake. I felt so grateful. I thought my future was secure. I thought my daughter had my back. I was so wrong. I was living in a dream. And the wake-up call was going to be more painful than I ever could have imagined. As the years began to catch up with me, I noticed the world becoming a bit more blurred at the edges. It started with the morning newspaper. The fine print of the stock market reports and the local obituaries seemed to dance on the page. My doctor told me it was macular degeneration. It is a frightening phrase for a woman who spent her entire life living through her eyes, living through the pages of books. Managing the cottage started to feel like a mountain I could no longer climb. Property taxes in New York are no joke. There were utility bills, insurance premiums, and the endless maintenance that comes with a lakeside home. Every time a thick envelope from the county clerk arrived, my heart would sink. I was terrified of making a mistake. I was terrified of missing a payment and losing the only thing I had left of my hard-earned life. That was when Tiffany started visiting more often. She was living in the city, always talking about her high-pressure job in marketing and the expensive parties she attended. But when she came to the cottage, she was different. She was my sweet girl again. She would bring me my favorite herbal tea and sit with me on the porch. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, we were sitting at the kitchen table. I was squinting at a tax assessment form, feeling tears of frustration welling up. Tiffany reached across the table and gently took the pen from my hand. Her voice was as smooth as silk. "Mom," she said, "you should not be stressing over these dusty old papers. You have worked hard enough. It is time for you to just be you." She leaned in closer, her eyes full of what I thought was genuine concern. She told me about a plan. She said that if I added her name to the deed as a co-owner, she could take over all the legal headaches. She told me she would handle the local authorities, the bank, and the contractors. "It is just for your protection, Mom," she whispered. "If anything happens to you, I can make sure the house stays in the family. We can make it a joint tenancy with right of survivorship. It makes things so much easier for everyone." She used all the right words. Protection. Family. Security. To a woman who was slowly losing her sight, those words were like a life jacket in a stormy sea. I felt a sense of immense relief. I thought to myself, how lucky I am to have a daughter who cares this much about my peace of mind. We went to a local notary the following week. I remember the smell of the stale coffee in that office. I remember the scratch of the pen on the heavy bond paper. Tiffany held my arm as I walked. She was so attentive. She was so kind. As I signed my name on the line, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I didn't see the way Tiffany's eyes changed when the notary stamped the document. I didn't see the cold, calculating look that replaced her smile for just a split second. "There we go," she said, tucking the folder into her expensive leather bag. "Now you can just focus on your books and the sunsets. I will handle the rest." I thanked her. I actually thanked her. I told her she was a blessing. I told her that her grandfather would be so proud of the woman she had become. For the next few months, everything seemed perfect. She told me the taxes were paid. She told me the insurance was updated. She kept me in a bubble of false security. It was a velvet trap, lined with soft words and warm tea. I was wandering deeper into the woods, and I had no idea that the path back home was already being burned behind me. Chapter 3. The Brutal Awakening. The morning of my awakening started like any other beautiful summer day. The mist was rising off the lake in thin, white ribbons. I had just poured my first cup of coffee and was heading out to my porch to listen to the songbirds. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and pine. It was the kind of morning that made me feel like all my years of work had been worth it. Then, I saw it. A white pickup truck pulled into my gravel driveway. A man stepped out, wearing a bright orange safety vest. He didn't look like a visitor. He looked like a man with a job to do. He carried a tripod and a high-tech surveying tool. I walked down the porch steps, my brow furrowed in confusion. I called out to him, "Excuse me? Can I help you? I think you might have the wrong address." The man didn't even look up at first. He was busy pounding a wooden stake into my garden, right in the middle of my prize-winning lavender. "This is the Miller property, right?" he asked, his voice flat and bored. "Yes," I replied, my voice trembling slightly. "But I didn't hire a surveyor. There must be some mistake." The man finally looked at me. He looked at me with a strange kind of pity. "I am not here for you, ma'am," he said. "I am here for the Sterling Development Group. They bought the land last month. We are marking the boundaries for the new luxury condo project." The world tilted. I felt the blood drain from my face. I grabbed the railing of the porch to keep from falling. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Bought the land?" I whispered. "That is impossible. I live here. I own this home." The man shrugged and pulled a clipboard from his truck. He showed me a copy of a sale agreement. There it was. My daughter's signature. Tiffany Miller. Beside it, the sale price was written out in cold, hard ink. $1,200,000. I stumbled back inside and grabbed my phone. My fingers were shaking so hard I could barely dial the number. Tiffany answered on the third ring. She sounded busy. She sounded different. Tiffany, I choked out. There is a man here, a surveyor. He says the house is sold. He says a developer bought it. Tell me it is a mistake. Please. Tell me it is a mistake. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, the sweet girl was gone. Her voice was like a shard of ice. It is not a mistake, Mom, she snapped. I told you I would handle the paperwork, and I did. I sold the property. It was sitting there doing nothing but eating up money. I am 30 years old, and I am tired of being the daughter of a broke librarian. I deserve more than a dusty cottage in the woods. But this is my home, I screamed into the phone. This was my dream. Dreams don't pay for Prada, Mom, she said, her voice dripping with arrogance. I have already moved into a penthouse in Manhattan. I have a new wardrobe that actually reflects the life I was meant to lead. You will get a small apartment in the city. I will send you the address. Don't make this difficult. She hung up. The dial tone sounded like a flat line in a hospital room. My sanctuary was gone. My daughter had sold my peace for a pile of clothes and a view of a concrete jungle. I looked out the window. The surveyor was still there. He was hammering another stake into the ground. Every blow of his mallet felt like it was hitting my heart. I realized then that the daughter I loved didn't exist. She had traded her soul for a designer label, and I was standing in the ruins of a life I no longer recognized. I was 65 years old, and for the first time in my life I was truly, utterly alone. The silence in the cottage after Tiffany hung up the phone was louder than any noise I had ever heard. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. I sat there, at my small wooden kitchen table, clutching my cold cup of coffee. Outside, I could still hear the muffled sounds of the surveyor. The clink of his metal tools felt like a hammer against my skull. I felt old. I felt small. But most of all, I felt a deep, burning sense of betrayal that I did not know a human heart could hold. I looked down at my hands. They were calloused from years of shelving books and gardening. I thought about every extra shift I took at the university library. I thought about the winter nights I walked home in the snow to save money on gas. I thought about the small, quiet life I had built. It was a life of dignity. It was a life of patience. I decided to call her back. My hands were shaking so much that I dropped the phone twice. When she finally answered, she didn't say hello. She just sighed. A long, dramatic sigh of annoyance. Mom, I told you not to make this difficult, she said. Her voice was cold. It was the voice of a stranger. Tiffany, I whispered, trying to keep my voice from breaking. I just want to understand. $1,200,000. That is a lot of money. But it is just money. This house. This house is your history. It is where you spent your summers. It is where your father and I dreamed of our retirement. How can you sell a dream for a check? I heard her scoff. I could almost see her rolling her eyes in some fancy office in the city. Dreams do not pay the bills, Mom, she said, her voice rising in irritation. And they certainly do not pay for Prada. Do you have any idea how hard it is to be the daughter of a librarian in this city? People look at my clothes. They look at where I live. I am 30 years old. I have spent my whole life feeling like I was second class because you wanted to live in the woods and read books. She started talking about her new life. She spoke about a penthouse in Manhattan with floor-to-ceiling windows. She spoke about designer dresses that cost more than I made in 3 months. She told me she had already spent a huge portion of the money on a wardrobe that she called an investment in her image, an investment in a life she felt she was meant to lead. I sold the place because I am done waiting for my life to start, she continued. That cottage was an anchor. It was dragging me down. Now I have the freedom I deserve. I bought a penthouse on the Upper East Side. I bought clothes from designers you cannot even pronounce. I am finally Tiffany Miller, the woman I was supposed to be. Not Tiffany Miller, the librarian's daughter. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I realized that my daughter didn't just sell a house. She had sold her soul. She had traded the love of her mother and the legacy of her family for a leather handbag and a view of a concrete street. "You sold your mother's piece for a wardrobe, Tiffany," I said, my voice finally becoming steady. "You sold the only place I ever felt safe. You sold my sanctuary for a moment of fashion." "It is not a moment, Mom. It is a lifestyle," she snapped. "The developer gave me a week to move your things out. I hired a cheap moving company to take your books to a studio apartment I found for you. It is in a quiet area. You will be fine. Just stop being so dramatic." She hung up again. This time, I didn't try to call back. I looked around my kitchen. I looked at the height marks on the door frame where she had grown up. I looked at the shelf where her father's ashes used to sit before I buried them under the oak tree. My dreams were not just tarnished. They were being bulldozed, and my own daughter was the one driving the machine. Chapter 5. Prisoner of the City. Moving day was the darkest day of my life. I stood by the lake as the moving truck pulled away, filled with 35 years of my life. The men were rough with my boxes. I heard the sound of glass breaking inside one of them, but I didn't even have the energy to complain. I just watched. As I drove away from the cottage for the last time, I looked in the rearview mirror. I saw the yellow bulldozers idling at the edge of the property. They looked like giant, hungry beasts waiting to devour my memories. I knew that by sunset, the porch where I had spent my happiest hours would be nothing but splinters and dust. The city was a shock to my system. Tiffany had found me a studio apartment in a part of town that felt grey and cold. There were no trees. There was no water. There was only the constant, aggressive hum of traffic and the smell of exhaust. The apartment was small. The windows were narrow and looked out onto a brick wall of the building next door. I felt like a prisoner. I sat in the middle of my boxes, surrounded by the ghosts of my life. My books, the ones I had spent a lifetime collecting, were stacked in the corner because there was no room for shelves. The silence of the lake was replaced by the sound of sirens and neighbors arguing through thin walls. I didn't leave the apartment for 3 days. I just sat in the dark. I thought about Tiffany and her penthouse. I thought about her walking on marble floors, wearing her $1,000 shoes, while I was trapped in this box. The contrast was a bitter pill to swallow. She was surrounded by luxury, and I was surrounded by shadows. Every morning, I would wake up, and for a split second, I would listen for the call of the loons on the water. Then, the sound of a city bus would roar past my window, and the reality would hit me all over again. I was 65 years old, and my world had shrunk to the size of a closet. I felt a deep sense of shame. I felt like I had failed as a mother. How did I raise a child who could be so cruel? How did I not see the greed growing inside her like a weed? I blamed myself for trusting her. I blamed myself for my failing eyes. But as I sat there in the gloom, I remembered something. It was a memory from a long time ago. I remembered my father sitting in his study, surrounded by old maps and thick legal books. He was a man who believed in the land. He always told me, "The house is just wood and nails, Sarah, but the land is forever." I stood up and began searching through the one box I had kept close to me. It was a small metal lockbox that had belonged to him. Tiffany had ignored it during her clean-out because it looked old and worthless. Inside were his original deeds, his handwritten notes, and the papers for a trust that had not been looked at in decades. My eyes were weak, but I used a magnifying glass. I spent hours reading the tiny, faded print. I read until my eyes burned and the sun began to set behind the brick wall outside. And then, I found it. I found the one thing Tiffany had overlooked. I found the one thing the developer's high-priced lawyers had missed. A small, narrow strip of land. A strip of land that changed everything. I looked at the brick wall outside my window, and for the first time in weeks I didn't feel like a prisoner. I felt like a woman who had just found the key to her cell. Tiffany thought she had sold my future. She thought she had left me with nothing, but she had forgotten that her mother was a librarian. And librarians know how to find the one piece of information that changes the entire story. I picked up the phone. But I didn't call Tiffany. I called the best real estate lawyer in the state of New York. It was time to show my daughter that while dreams might not pay for Prada, a well-managed land deed can bring $1 million project to its knees. The city was loud, and my apartment was dark. But for the first time, I could see the light at the end of the tunnel. And it wasn't a train. It was justice. In that grey, cramped studio apartment in the city, time seemed to move differently. The days were marked by the sound of the garbage truck at 5 a.m. and the neon hum of the streetlights at night. I sat on the floor, surrounded by the only things I had left. One of those things was an old, battered metal lockbox that had belonged to my father. It was a heavy, olive-green box with scratches that told a story of many decades. My father was a man of the earth. He had been a land surveyor in the Adirondacks for over 40 years. He was the kind of man who wore flannel shirts even in the summer and always had a pencil tucked behind his ear. He didn't trust banks, and he didn't trust fast-talking men in suits. He used to tell me, "Sarah, a man's word is his bond, but a land deed is his fortress." He believed that owning a piece of America was the greatest privilege a person could have. I remember watching him work when I was just a little girl. He would spread out massive blue maps on the kitchen table. He would use a magnifying glass to study the tiny lines that divided the woods and the water. He was obsessed with details. He used to say that most people only look at what is on the land, but a wise man looks at how the land is held. As I sat in that dark apartment, I pulled the lockbox closer. The key was hidden inside an old locket I wore around my neck. When I opened it, the smell of old cedar and tobacco filled the room. It was the smell of my childhood. It was the smell of safety. Inside were layers of yellowed envelopes, each one labelled in his neat, architect's handwriting. I began to read. My eyesight was poor, so I had to use a magnifying glass and a bright desk lamp. I spent hours, perhaps even days, going through the history of our property. Tiffany had been so eager to sell the cottage that she had only looked at the most recent tax records. She saw the house, she saw the yard, and she saw $1 million check. She never bothered to look back at the original documents from 1955. But I looked. I looked until my eyes burned. And that was when I saw it. The property was not just one single piece of land. My father, in his infinite wisdom, had divided it into 2 distinct parcels. There was the land where the house sat. That was the parcel Tiffany had been added to as a co-owner. But there was a second parcel. It was a narrow 60-foot strip of land that ran exactly along the shoreline. It was the only way to get from the house to the water. And here was the most important part. My father had not left that strip of land in the house deed. Instead, he had placed that specific lakefront strip into a separate, private trust. A trust that was created solely for me. The language was very clear. It stated that the lakefront access could only be sold, leased, or transferred with the express written consent of the trustee. And the only trustee listed was me, Sarah Miller. I leaned back against the wall, my heart racing. I realized exactly what had happened. Tiffany had sold the house. She had sold the garden. She had sold the driveway. But she did not own the beach. She did not own the path to the water. In the eyes of the law, the developer had bought $1 million house that was legally cut off from the lake. In the world of luxury real estate, a lakeside home without lake access is just a house in the woods. The Sterling Development Group was planning to build 40 luxury condos. Their entire marketing plan was based on having a private, exclusive beach. But according to these papers, that beach belonged to me. Not the developer. Not Tiffany. Just me. I felt a sudden surge of strength. It was as if my father was standing right there in that tiny apartment, putting his hand on my shoulder. He had protected me from beyond the grave. He knew that the world could be a greedy place. He had built a fortress for me, and I had finally found the door. I spent the rest of the night organizing the papers. I made copies. I highlighted the trust language. I felt like a librarian again, doing the most important research of my life. Tiffany thought she had left me with nothing. She thought I was just a lonely old woman in a dark room. But I was the owner of the most valuable 60 feet of dirt in the entire county. The next morning, I didn't cry. I didn't feel like a prisoner. I walked down to the local post office and sent a certified letter to the Sterling Development Group. I also sent a copy to Tiffany's fancy new address in Manhattan. I didn't include a long letter of anger. I didn't scream. I simply sent a one-page notice. It said, "Please be advised that you are currently trespassing on a private trust. All construction activity on the lakefront parcel must cease immediately." I walked back to my apartment with a smile on my face. I knew the storm was coming. I knew Tiffany would be furious. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't afraid of the storm. I was the storm. My father's legacy was not just a piece of paper. It was my path back to the light. Chapter 7. The Silent Strike. The reaction to my letter was almost instantaneous. Within 48 hours, the silence of my studio apartment was shattered by the constant ringing of the phone. First came the lawyers from the Sterling Development Group. They were polite at first, using big words and a professional tone. They told me there must be a clerical error. They offered to send a representative to clean up the paperwork and offered me a small check for my troubles. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I simply said, "The land is not for sale." And then I hung up. Then came Tiffany. Her calls were not polite. She called me at 2 in the morning, her voice shrill and panicked. She wasn't asking how I was doing. She wasn't apologizing for taking my home. She was screaming about her reputation. "Mom, what are you doing?" she shrieked into the phone. "The developers are threatening to sue me for misrepresentation. They say I sold them a lakeside property that doesn't have a lake. You are ruining everything. Just sign the release for the trust, and I will make sure you get a little extra money every month." Don't be a bitter old woman. I listened to her voice, and it felt like listening to a stranger. There was no love in her words. There was only greed and fear. "Tiffany," I said calmly, "you sold my sanctuary for a closet full of clothes. You didn't care about my life, so why should I care about your wardrobe? The land is in a trust. It stays in the trust. Good night." I blocked her number. It was the most liberating thing I had ever done. The situation at the lake began to escalate. Because I refused to grant access to the water, the State Environmental Board had to step in. A luxury condo project cannot be approved if it violates land trust boundaries. The bulldozers stopped. The workers were sent home. The cranes stood silent against the sky. The developers were losing money every single day. They had loans to pay. They had investors who were getting nervous. Interest rates were rising, and their million-dollar paradise was turning into a legal swamp. They sent another lawyer to my door. This time he wasn't polite. He tried to intimidate me. He sat in my tiny apartment, looking disgusted by the surroundings. He told me that they would take me to court. He told me they would tie me up in litigation until I was 90 years old. He told me I would die broke and alone. I looked him straight in the eye. I didn't blink. "I am a 65-year-old librarian," I told him. "I have spent my life surrounded by stories of heroes and villains. I know how this ends. You can sue me. You can spend millions of dollars on your fancy lawyers. But you cannot build a beach on land you do not own. And as for being alone, I have my books, and I have my father's legacy. That is more than your company will have when this project collapses." I showed him the door. That was the beginning of the silent strike. I didn't go to the newspapers. I didn't make a scene. I simply sat in my apartment and waited. I knew that time was on my side. Every day that passed was another day of lost revenue for the developer. Every day was another day of legal fees for Tiffany. The project stalled completely. The Sterling Development Group eventually realized that I was not going to break. They couldn't build the condos without the beach, and they couldn't get the beach without me. They started looking for a way out. They began to turn their sights on the person who had sold them the property in the first place. They sued Tiffany. They sued her for $1,200,000 plus damages for selling a property under pretenses. They accused her of fraud. They accused her of concealing the existence of the trust. Tiffany's world of Prada and Manhattan penthouses began to crumble. She had already spent hundreds of thousands of dollars. She had bought the furniture. She had bought the clothes. She had leased a luxury car. She didn't have the money to pay them back. She called me from a different number, sobbing. Mom, please. They are taking everything. The bank is freezing my accounts. I am going to lose the penthouse. Please, just sell them the strip of land. You can save me. I sat in my dark apartment, looking at the brick wall outside. I thought about the day the surveyor hammered a stake into my lavender. I thought about the smell of the pine trees I would never smell again. I'm sorry, Tiffany, I said. But as you told me, dreams don't pay for anything. You made your choice. You chose the wardrobe. I chose the land. I hope your clothes keep you warm, because the lakefront is staying exactly where it is. I hung up the phone. I felt a deep, quiet peace. Justice was not a loud, angry thing. It was quiet. It was steady. It was the sound of a librarian closing a book after the final chapter. The developer was retreating. Tiffany was falling, and I was finally ready to go home. Not to the house she sold, but to the future my father had paved for me 60 years ago. Watching someone's world crumble from a distance is a strange thing. For months, I heard nothing but the echoes of Tiffany's life through my lawyer and the occasional tabloid headline about the failed lakefront project. The Sterling Development Group did not play fair. In the world of high-stakes real estate, they were sharks. And Tiffany? She was just a girl who thought $1 million made her invincible. The lawsuit was brutal. The developers sued her for every penny of the $1,200,000 she had received. They added on damages for lost time, interest, and the millions they had spent on construction and marketing. They accused her of fraudulent misrepresentation. They claimed she had knowingly lied about owning the lake access to secure the sale. I sat in my small apartment and read the legal updates. Tiffany tried to fight them at first. She hired a flashy lawyer from a firm on Park Avenue. She spent tens of thousands of dollars just on the initial filings. She was still trying to maintain the image of the successful Manhattan socialite. But you cannot maintain an image when your foundation is built on sand. The court moved fast. In America, when you owe a powerful corporation money, the wheels of justice turn very quickly. Tiffany's bank accounts were frozen. The penthouse on the Upper East Side, the one she had bragged about so loudly, was placed under a lien. I heard that she was served with an eviction notice on a Tuesday morning, right in front of her new high society friends. The most painful part for her, I imagine, was the loss of the wardrobe, the clothes she had traded my peace for. The Prada bags, the Gucci shoes, the silk dresses that cost more than my first car. Because she had used the stolen money to buy them, the court treated them as assets to be seized. I remember my lawyer telling me about the day the movers came to her penthouse. This time they weren't moving her things into a new home, they were taking them to an auction house. They packed up her designer shoes in plastic bins. They draped her expensive coats over rolling racks. They took it all. The furniture, the jewelry, every single thing that she thought defined her as a person. She called me one last time. She didn't sound like a socialite anymore. She sounded like a frightened child. Her voice was raspy, and I could hear the sounds of a busy New York street in the background. "Mom," she sobbed. "I am standing on the sidewalk with 2 suitcases. That is all they let me keep. The bank took the car. The landlord changed the locks. I have nowhere to go. My friends, they won't even answer my texts. Please, I am your daughter. I am your flesh and blood." I closed my eyes. I felt a pang of sadness, but it was buried under a mountain of reality. I thought about the 35 years I had worked. I thought about the way she had looked at me when she said that my dreams didn't pay for Prada. "Tiffany," I said softly, "you chose a wardrobe over a mother. You chose a penthouse over a home. Now, you have to live with those choices. I am a 65-year-old woman living in a grey room because of you. I cannot save you from yourself." "But I have nothing!" she screamed. "I am broke! I am ruined!" "No," I replied. "You have exactly what you valued. You have your pride, and you have your labels. I hope they are enough to get you through the night." I hung up. A week later, I heard that she had vanished from the city. The socialite was gone. The penthouse was sold at a courthouse auction. The name Tiffany Miller became a cautionary tale in the real estate world. She had tried to buy a soul with a designer label, and in the end, she had lost both. Chapter 9. A new beginning. As the dust settled on Tiffany's downfall, a new door began to open for me. The Sterling Development Group was in a desperate position. They couldn't build their condos, but they had already invested millions into the site. They needed to move on. But they couldn't sell the property to anyone else, with my trust claim hanging over it like a dark cloud. My lawyer, a sharp man who reminded me of my father, sat me down in his wood-panelled office. He had a look of quiet triumph on his face. "Sarah," he said, "the developers want to walk away, but they need you to release your claim on that lakefront strip so they can sell the land to a local conservancy group. They are willing to pay a very significant settlement to make this go away." The significant settlement was more money than I had ever seen in my entire life as a librarian. It was enough to cover the loss of my old home and then some. I signed the papers. I didn't feel greedy. I felt justified. I wasn't taking their money. I was being compensated for the theft of my peace. I didn't stay in that dark city apartment for another day. I packed my books. I packed my father's lockbox. And I headed back to the place I belonged. Back to the water. Back to the trees. I didn't buy back the old property. It had too many bad memories now. The bulldozers had already done their work, and the ground was scarred. Instead, I found a new piece of land. It was further up the coast, in a quiet cove that felt even more secluded. It was a beautiful 2-story cottage with a wraparound porch and large clear windows. It had a stone fireplace that smelled like cedar. It had a garden that was already filled with wild roses and sage. And most importantly, it had a long, private dock that stretched out into the deep blue water of the lake. When I walked onto the porch for the first time, I sat in my new rocking chair. I took a deep breath of the pine-scented air. For the first time in 2 years, I didn't feel like a prisoner. I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like Sarah Miller again. I used a portion of the settlement money to set up a new trust. This one wasn't for me. It was for the local library where I had worked for so many years. I wanted to make sure that other people could find the same joy in books that had sustained me through my darkest hours. I spent my days gardening. I spent my evenings reading by the fire. My eyesight was still failing, but I bought a high-tech reading machine that projected the words onto a large screen. I adapted. I survived. I realized that a home is not just wood and nails. It is a feeling of safety. It is the knowledge that you have lived your life with integrity. Sometimes, I would look at the water and think about Tiffany. I wondered where she was. I wondered if she ever looked at the sky and regretted what she had done. But I didn't let those thoughts stay for long. I had learned a very valuable lesson. You can forgive someone, but that doesn't mean you have to let them back in to destroy your peace. I was 67 years old now. I had a beautiful home. I had my books. And I had the quiet, steady rhythm of the lake to keep me company. I had lost my first sanctuary to greed, but I had built a second one on the foundation of truth and justice. As the sun began to set over the mountains, casting a golden glow over the water, I realized that my father was right. The land is forever, and as long as you have a place where your soul can rest, you are the richest person in the world. I picked up my book, adjusted my glasses, and began to read. The chapter of my life with Tiffany was closed, but a beautiful, new chapter was just beginning. 2 years had passed since the walls of my first cottage were torn down. 2 years since I had heard the sound of my daughter's voice. In that time, the seasons had changed. And so had I. My new home was more than just a house. It was a fortress of peace. My garden was thriving with sunflowers and tomatoes. My library was organized. I had found a rhythm to my life that felt like a long, slow exhale. It was a late Tuesday afternoon in October. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and turning leaves. The lake was a deep, dark blue, reflecting the golden orange of the trees on the opposite shore. I was sitting on my porch, wrapped in a thick wool blanket that my grandmother had knitted decades ago. I had a cup of hot cider in my hand and a book of poetry on my lap. I was watching the public walking path that wound along the edge of the woods, far below my property line. Most of the time, I only saw the occasional hiker or a neighbor walking their dog. But that day, I saw someone different. A woman was walking slowly. She looked tired. Her backpack was tattered, and her clothes were far too thin for the autumn chill. She stopped every few yards to catch her breath. As she got closer to the edge of my property, she stopped and looked up at my house. My heart skipped a beat. Even from a distance, even with my failing eyes, I knew that silhouette. I knew the way she tilted her head. I stood up, the wool blanket slipping from my shoulders. I walked to the edge of the porch railing and waited. The woman climbed the small hill toward my gate. When she reached the fence, she collapsed onto her knees. She didn't look like a Manhattan socialite. She didn't look like a girl who owned $1 million wardrobe. She looked like a ghost. Her skin was dark and leathery from too much sun. Her hair, once perfectly styled and highlighted, was a matted mess of grey and brown. She was wearing a pair of dirty sneakers and a stained windbreaker. She looked up at me, and I saw the hollow, haunted look in her eyes. "Mom," she whispered. Her voice was thin and raspy. It sounded like dry leaves scraping against pavement. I didn't move. I didn't run to her. I just stood there, letting the silence of the lake settle between us. "Tiffany," I said. My voice was calm. It was steady. She began to sob. It was a deep, ugly sound. She told me everything. She told me how the banks had taken the penthouse. She told me how her friends had vanished the moment she was no longer buying the champagne. She told me she had spent the last 6 months living in a tattered nylon tent in a state park 10 miles away. "I have nothing, Mom," she wailed, her hands clutching the wooden gate. "I have been eating at soup kitchens. I have been sleeping on the cold ground. I lost the penthouse. I lost the clothes. I lost everything. Please, I am your daughter. I am cold, and I am so hungry. Please, let me come inside. Just for a night. Just for a meal." I looked at her. I looked at the daughter I had raised. And then I looked past her. I looked at the beautiful, calm water of the lake. I thought about the night she told me that my dreams didn't pay for Prada. I thought about the dark, grey studio apartment where I had sat in the shadows for months because she wanted a designer lifestyle. "Tiffany," I said, my voice carrying across the yard. "Do you remember the night you sold the cottage? Do you remember when I cried and told you it was my only sanctuary?" She looked down at the dirt, her shoulders shaking. "I was wrong, Mom. I was stupid. I'm sorry." "Sorry is a word people use when they break a glass," I said. "It is not a word for when you break a person's life. You told me that dreams don't pay for anything. You told me that I was just a librarian and that you deserved a better life. You chose your wardrobe. You chose the penthouse. You chose to leave me with nothing. But I have nowhere to go," she screamed, her desperation turning into a flash of the old anger. "You have this big house. You have all this money. How can you be so cruel?" "It is not cruelty, Tiffany," I replied. "It is a lesson. You sold my peace for a moment of fashion. You traded a mother for a label. And now, you are learning what I already knew. You can't buy a soul with a designer handbag, and you can't find a home in a penthouse if you have no love in your heart." I leaned forward, looking her straight in the eyes. "My lakefront is now a protected wildlife sanctuary," I told her. "I have worked hard to make sure this land stays peaceful and safe. I think living in that tent for a little longer will give you plenty of time to reflect. You need to think about the difference between a closet and a home. You need to think about what it means to be a daughter." "Are you really going to leave me out here?" she whispered. "I am leaving you with the consequences of your own choices," I said. "I have a small bag of groceries on the porch that I was going to take to the local pantry. You can take it with you, but you cannot come inside. This is my sanctuary, Tiffany, and you are no longer allowed to burn it down." I walked over to the porch, picked up the bag of food, and walked to the gate. I set it down on the ground. I didn't touch her. I didn't hug her. I simply stood back. Tiffany looked at the bag of bread and canned soup. She looked at me with a mixture of hatred and shock. She realized then that I wasn't the weak, old woman she had manipulated. I was the woman my father had raised me to be. I was a woman who knew the value of the land and the weight of a person's word. She picked up the bag and turned away. She walked back down the path, her shadow long and thin in the fading light. I watched her until she disappeared into the trees. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel like I had won. But I did feel a sense of completion. I went back inside my warm, cedar-scented home. I locked the door. I sat by the fireplace and opened my book. The loons were calling out on the lake again. The sound was haunting and beautiful. I realized that Tiffany was right about one thing. She did have a penthouse. She had the whole sky for a roof. But she had no place to call home, because home is something you build with kindness, not with $1 million check. She had traded my sanctuary for a moment of fashion, and in doing so, she had sold her own future. She was a nomad in designer rags, and I was a librarian in a wooden cottage. And as I turned the page of my book, I knew that justice was the ultimate stylist. It always makes sure that in the end, we are all wearing exactly what we deserve. As the fire in my heart begins to dim, I find myself thinking about the long road that brought me here. I am sitting in my favorite armchair, the one with the faded floral pattern that Tiffany always hated. She called it old-fashioned. But to me, it is the most comfortable seat in the world because it was earned with 35 years of honest work. The lake outside is silent now. The moon is a thin silver sliver hanging over the dark water. I know that somewhere out there, in the cold autumn night, my daughter is sitting in a tent. She is probably shivering. She is probably looking at her hands and wondering how they lost their grip on $1 million life. It is a heavy thing. A mother's heart. I do not take joy in her suffering. I truly do not. But I have realized that there is a difference between being a mother and being a mat for someone to walk on. By letting her go, I am giving her the only thing of value she has ever received. I am giving her the truth. You see, in this modern world, we are told that happiness can be bought. We are told that a designer label can hide a hollow soul. We are told that a penthouse makes you a queen. But Tiffany learned the hard way that when the money is gone and the clothes are tattered, all you have left is your character. And if you have sold your character for a wardrobe, you are truly bankrupt. I want to share a small note with all of you watching. While this story was crafted as a narrative to be engaging and easy to follow, the message it carries is what truly matters. The events were written to illustrate a point, but the lesson is very real. It is a lesson about legacy. It is a lesson about respecting those who paved the way for you. In America, we used to value the long game. We valued the slow build of a life well lived. I hope this story reminds you to cherish your sanctuary, whatever that may be. I hope it reminds you that tough love is sometimes the only love that can save a lost soul. As I prepare to close my eyes for the night, I feel a deep sense of gratitude. I am 67 years old. I have my books. I have my father's wisdom. And I have the peace of mind that comes from knowing I did not let greed win. Thank you for walking this path with me through these 10 chapters. Your time is a gift, and I am honored that you chose to spend it here. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment and let us know what home means to you. God bless you, and may your own sanctuary always be filled with the things that money can never buy. This has been Sarah's story. Good night, and stay well.